can be recording this meeting, so apologies for that. I'm going to go ahead and continue. So again, my name is Brad Pillen. I'm the Sustainability and Resilience Project Manager with the City of Beverly. Welcome to our first public forum for the Bass River District Resilience Study, and thank you for being here. The goal of this project is to understand the impact of future flooding in the Bass River District and to understand how we can adapt to projected sea level rise and storm surge along the Bass River. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Please be sure that your microphone is muted. Note that we are recording this session and we'll post it so that people can view who were not able to attend tonight. And we will be asking a few poll questions during the meeting to hear from you. And we'll also include time for questions at the end. You're welcome to submit questions into the chat during the presentation if you'd like. Just keep in mind that we will answer these at the end. And at the end, you'll also have an opportunity just to raise your hand and ask questions if you prefer as well. I'd like to introduce members of the project team who will be presenting tonight. In addition to city staff, we also have Katie Moniz from Tetra Tech, Nasser Brahim from Woods Hole Group, and Allison Fry from Salem Sound Coast Watch. Thanks to each of them, as well as other members of the project team who are here and involved in this work, including Michelle Rowden, who is our regional coordinator with the state MVP program that's funding this project. Next slide, please. So before we go into more detail about the study, I'd like just to share more specifically about the geographic area of the Bass River District. As you can see in this map, it's bound in the north by Route 62 or Elliott Street, to the east by the MBTA commuter rail tracks, to the south at the intersection of Weber Ave and River Street, which is also where the National Grid substation is, and to the Bass River, and by the Bass River to the west. Next slide, please. The Bass River District is one of the most vulnerable areas in the city to the future impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, and storm surge. And we're undertaking this project to better understand the impact of flooding along the Bass River District, along the Bass River and in the Bass River District. We received a $200,000 grant from the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, also commonly referred to as the MVP program, through the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And the city also contributed a $67,000 match to this project. This grant began in late 2022 and runs through June of this year. One of the things we know is that frequency and intensity of coastal flooding is going to increase in the future. One of the goals of this study is to better understand what this increase will look like and to develop appropriate flood resilience strategies to protect critical infrastructure and assets in the Bass River District. With that, I'll pass it over to Mayor Cahill.
Thank you, Brad. It's good to see everybody. I will just share a couple of thoughts from the notes Brad gave me. First, this is language from the grant that is funding this project. By addressing coastal flood risk in the Bass River District, this grant will help shape the future of this growing community, reinforce critical utility services in the area, promote maritime recreation uses, and protect the vulnerable residents within this floodplain. So as many of you know, the city has been having discussions about the Bass River waterfront, particularly on the right-hand side of the river looking upstream. It's been a part of two successive city master plans and several public discussions over the years around potential rezoning for redevelopment along the waterfront. As people who've been engaged directly in the conversation over the last couple of years also know, when the state was required to close the Hall-Whitaker Bridge permanently, we all acknowledged and agreed that we couldn't really further discuss the Bass River zoning overlay concept as long as we don't have a Hall-Whitaker Bridge to drive across. So the work is ongoing to try to get a temporary fixed span bridge permitted and built. And when we get a little closer to the opening of that bridge, will be a more appropriate time to revisit the Bass River zoning overlay. So that times up pretty well with this work, because when we were last discussing this during the summer and fall of 2021, we also were getting a good look at the 2070 projected sea level rise maps, and it became clear that we really needed to do this type of an analysis and study of just how we can and should look at this resource for the community. And so through this study that is underway, we're doing our due diligence to better understand potential impacts of flooding from sea level rise and from storm surges, and to understand what measures we can take to reduce that impact and help guide the future of this district. With that said, I'd like to acknowledge a few of my colleagues in local government. Well, first we have our Director of Planning for the city, Darlene Nguyen. We have our Sustainability Director, Irina Keefe. We have our Harbor Master, Peter Dickman. We have Assistant City Engineer, Lisa Chandler, all with us. Thanks for being part of the conversation tonight. And I'd like to just also acknowledge three city councilors who are here with us. And those are Councilor at Large Sweeney and Bowen, and Ward 2 Councilor Rand. If any of the three of you want to say hi and share a thought, please feel free to do so now. Maybe all three of you.
Just a friendly hello from Councilor Rand here, Ward 2. And I'm glad to be here and learn more about what you're finding out about flooding in the Bass River. So thanks.
Thanks, Councilor. Councilor Sweeney said hi in the chat. Thanks. Good to see you, Councilor Sweeney. Councilor Bowen.
I don't have video on. Yeah, I don't have video on either, but really excited to learn and to see the process go forward and how we can help drive some more engagement in the process overall.
Thank you. Thank you all. With that, why don't I turn it back to Brad? Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we're actually going to move on to our first poll question. So split up here. So what ward do you live or work in? If you both live and work in Beverly in different wards, you are welcome to answer twice. And if you're not sure, you don't live or work in Beverly, that's okay too. All right, so it looks like we have most people here from Ward 2, and also good representation from Ward 1, Ward 3, Ward 4, and Ward 6. All right, and with that, we're going to pass it to Katie Moniz from Tetra Tech.
Good evening, everyone. I've had the pleasure of working with the city of Beverly for a number of years now, first on the coastal vulnerability study, and then on some of this early MVP planning. And the takeaway for me and all the work that we've been able to do with your community is really an understanding that the Bass River District is incredibly important to many people. And I want to talk through, just for everyone here, what are some of the key features along the water's edge in particular that make this district so popular. One is starting at the north closest to Route 62, one of the major supermarkets within the area and within the region here, a long-term stop and shop facility that many people often will report is key to their personal food security and weekly errands runs. There's also a municipal park here at Innocente Park, and that also features the McPherson Youth Center and the city's relationship there with the YMCA and the types of programmings that can really be a benefit to the youth of Beverly and surrounding areas. Next slide, please. A little further south in the district here, we have a little concrete building that many people don't actually recognize when they walk by, which is actually the Margin Street Stormwater Pump Station, located right on the edge of the Bass River here. We'll talk about it in a little bit more depth, but it is really key to keeping some of the inland areas over near Chase Street neighborhood dry during rain events. We've also got a long-term property owner at the existing lumberyard, which is just south of Bridge Street. Next slide, please. We have a number of yacht clubs and marinas, one located up near the existing supermarket, another one further to the south here next to the existing lumberyard. And last but not least, a major utility substation, and that is the National Grid facility on River Street. So these are key features of the district that people often come from other parts of Beverly and the region to visit. they're also some of the key drivers of the important utilities that people enjoy in their homes, even in inland areas of Beverly. So we really do think this district is tremendously important to the community in a number of different ways. And you're going to see some of the early work that we've done to really understand it better so that we can really start coming up with some good flood solutions here that you can implement in the future. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Brad to do a poll question.
Great. So our next poll question, how often do you pass through the Bass River District? So this could be driving, walking, biking, however you might get around, and includes if your destination is in the Bass River District as well. So how often do you pass through? Daily, about 4 to 6 times a week, about 2 to 3 times a week, or 1 time or fewer per week. We'll give people just a few moments. Great, and it looks like most people who are here. Oh, just a moment. So it looks like most people who are here pass through about daily, and others less so. Pretty equal representation between 4 to 6, 2 or 3 times per week, or once or fewer. But a good number of people here are passing through the Bass River District on a daily basis. All right, so I believe, are we going to Nasser here?
Yes, thanks.
Okay.
I'm Nasser Brahim, Senior Coastal Resiliency Specialist at Woods Hole Group. We've also been working with Katie along with the city for a number of years on the city's planning and adaptation initiatives. So I'm here to talk to you about findings from the coastal flooding exposure analysis that we've done so far. One is, as shown in the photos on the left, coastal flooding is an existing problem in the district, not only during storms, but also during annual high tides or king tides. Tidal flooding is expected to worsen due to sea level rise, and the map on the right-hand side shows the predicted extent of daily flooding from high tides in 2030, 2050, and 2070. These are based on the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, which is the state recommended tool for preparing for climate change and coastal flooding in Massachusetts. And it incorporates a high rate of sea level rise. So it's very unlikely that sea level rise will be worse than what we're showing here. And if sea level rise happens at a slower rate, then the flood risks shown on these maps may not occur until 20 to 30 years later. So for example, the 2070 results may not occur until 2100. But as you can see, daily high tide flooding is expected to become a very serious problem around 2070. Before that, though, the highest tides of the year can still cause significant flooding. And that's not shown here, but important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. This map on the right shows the predicted extent of flooding in more rare and extreme storms in present 2030, 2050, and 2070. And these have a 1% or a 1 in 100 chance of happening each year. Coastal flooding risk is predicted to grow due to sea level rise, and this map also accounts for storms becoming more intense in 2050 and 2070, which scientists expect to happen. It feels like this is happening already. You can see that over time, the area expands over the coming decades, with flood risk expanding from the waterfront properties onto McPherson Drive and River Street, and via a flood pathway on Federal Street into low-lying inland areas that's shown in the photo on the left-hand side. Next slide, please. Finally, you can see that the depth of flooding in these more rare and extreme storms are predicted to become very dangerous over the long term. On the top square, you can see that there might be up to a foot of flooding in the Stop and Shop parking lot in an extreme event in 2050, increasing to 3.5 feet in 2070. In the middle square, you can see flood depths around 2.5 feet on Federal Street and Park Street in an extreme event in 2050 and over 5 feet in 2070. And on the bottom at the electrical substation, flood depths could be over 5 feet in 2050 and over 10 feet in 2070 in an extreme event. So these are obviously significant concerns. And as we move forward through the strategy development process, we'll be working to come up with strategies to mitigate these risks. Next slide. I believe it's a poll question. It's back to you, Brad.
Great, thank you, Nasser. For our next poll question, have you seen or been impacted by flooding in the Bass River District? Great, and it looks like we have a fairly overwhelming response for yes. People have seen or been impacted by flooding in the Bass River District, as well as someone who has not, or a few people who have not and are often or sometimes in this area, but have not seen flooding in this area or been impacted. All right, so moving on, we are going to pass it to Allison Fry from Salem Sound Coast Watch, or excuse me, we're going to keep it with Nasser. My mistake.
Actually, sorry, it's Katie again.
Oh, sorry, Katie, my mistake.
No problem. But I'll talk about Nasser a little bit here because our partners at Woods Hole Group were part of the group that worked on coastal resource areas. And what I mean by that is to take a look at the natural spaces that we have here that exist along the Bass River. And Woods Hole Group's field team went out there and delineated it, and they created the wonderful map that you're seeing here to the right of your screen. To identify those resource areas and allow us to think about how we can enhance them in the future, try to protect them, and in some locations, maybe even expand them to provide flood protection. So what types of natural coastal resources are we seeing out here? The majority of the area really is coastal bank. So that productive habitat value between the river and the edge of the developed universe that you're seeing here in orange. It's fairly narrow in some spaces, but it certainly does widen up in areas, including where the trails are today that wrap around the supermarket, and then further down near the yacht club and dock lane. You are seeing some very small areas of existing salt marsh, tiny little corners there. You're seeing that in that teal hatched color. And then you have a limited amount really up near Route 62 and Elliott Street of that rocky intertidal zone. And so while the areas of natural coastal resources along the Bass River may not be expansive, that doesn't mean that they're not productive in creating a little bit of flood protection even today. And as we continue developing solutions here, we'll really look at ways that the community can invest in these spaces and think about them as potential flood protection and the opportunity to introduce more habitat directly to the Bass River. Next slide, please. What else are we looking at when we think flood protection? We're thinking about what are the types of land uses most predominantly here in Bass River District. So we've kind of put them into three categories, thinking about their overall function and purpose. In purple, we've got those community assets or critical infrastructure that we showed. So that's everything from Innocente Park and the youth center down to the Margin Street pump station and that big utility substation at the end of River Street. And so the types of protections for those types of assets may be functionally different than the ones that we use for other types of properties. In green, we're showing here sites that are being used for commercial and industrial use today. And we think about those on both sides of River Street. We think about the different types of businesses and operations that are happening there. And we think about the future of those spaces over time, whether they'll change the types of land uses and businesses that are being operated there, and whether or not there are interventions that make sense to make those sites more attractive for people to be able to continue to use and enjoy them. And then we look at marine uses, and recreational boating is hugely important to Beverly. And I've had an opportunity to talk to lots of individuals over my years working with the city of Beverly that really say it's one of the great drivers of why people love to live here so much. And so one of the opportunities we have as part of this project is really to engage with marine users and understand how changing sea level rise creates opportunities and challenges for those existing uses and how we need to modify or adapt them to protect them from these coastal storms. Next slide, please. And then Margin Street Pump Station. So when we worked on a critical assets list for both the hazard mitigation plan and the coastal vulnerability plan, one of the lights that just kept going off was Margin Street Pump Station. So it is that little concrete building that you see at the edge of the park. It is actually the sole driver of about 300 acres of inland storm drainage for the Chase Street neighborhood. And so what happens is you have lower lying neighborhoods that may not be able to discharge their stormwater by gravity. And this station allows that water to be pushed up and through into the Bass River, and to make sure that we can keep inland neighborhoods nice and dry during storm events. The challenge is if the river is coming up, the building itself could be vulnerable, but it also could be significantly harder to be able to pump that rainwater out when it is in fact raining. And that's actually one of the challenges that really NASA highlighted with the tidal projection maps, which is if the river keeps coming up on the elevation of the outfall, it'll get harder and harder for the station to function every day. A couple of other things about this particular station. It is the only stormwater pumping station in Beverly. Lots of other stations out here pump wastewater or sewage. This one is pumping, again, rainwater, so that means it's not running every single day here. But we've got a couple of good pictures of what it looks like inside. And you'll notice a lot of its equipment is pretty close to the elevation of the floor. And so we worry about those tidal flooding events and those coastal flooding events that could penetrate these doors, because you don't want electronics to get wet. And salt water is very, very corrosive. So over time, it could really damage the equipment and the pumps here. So what we're thinking on Margin Street Pump Station is how to think about its useful function today, but also to really plan well for the future. And this is one of those very critical locations where you have a station that's very close to the water's edge. So we'll be working on some very specific interventions to make sure that the Margin Street Pump Station is protected for the long term. Next slide, please. Back to you, Brad.
Great. So we have our final poll question here. So what activities do you do in the Bass River District? These can include grocery shop, shopping, not grocery shopping, or shopping that's non-grocery. If you work in the Bass River District, getting together with family or friends, participating in programs at the McPherson Youth Center, and other recreation, which can include boating, picnics, sports, walking, or anything else that would fall under that category. And this is multiple choice, so feel free to check all that apply. Great, so it looks like the most common activity is recreation, followed pretty closely by grocery shopping. And it looks like there's also a strong number of people who like to get together with family and friends in this area. Great, thank you. So now we are going to pass it over to Allison with Salem Sound Coast Watch.
Hi, Allison Fry, Associate Director at Salem Sound Coast Watch, who's leading the community engagement for this study, which includes events that bring folks down to the Bass River to learn about the project, as well as interviews with local business owners throughout the course of the study. So we held our first cleanup event along the Bass River a few weeks ago. We focused north of the Bass Haven Yacht Club along the public river walk. We had a total of 56 volunteers, which included a large group of Beverly Middle School students, as well as some longtime Salem Sound Coast Watch volunteers. Over the course of about an hour, we cleaned up 241 pounds of trash from the area, which included pulling 2 grocery carts from the water, as you can see in the group photo. Next slide. We also held our first walk and talk along the Bass River on March 11th. 28 brave community members joined us on a cold, snowy day. We shared a little bit about the history of the Bass River District and discussed the current and future flooding impacts of the area. We had an installation at Innocenti Park using flags, which showed the extent and depth of flooding from storms in 2030. And you can see that in the bottom center photo. And we also used a measuring stick to show the flooding depths at the stormwater pump station in 2030 and 2070. And there's a video from BevCam and the city that highlights the walk and talk that we'll show at the end of this meeting. Next slide. And finally, we've been meeting with local businesses in the Bass River District to hold stakeholder interviews. So during these meetings with business owners, we're able to share more information about the project and the future flooding conditions, and then learn about their experience with flooding, their concerns, and any future plans as business owners in this area. And so far, we've met with almost half of the businesses in the district, and everyone has been receptive and interested in learning more about solutions. And we'll continue to do these remaining interviews with businesses before the study wraps up. Next slide. And we're excited to offer some upcoming engagement events. We'll be holding a second cleanup around Innocenti Park with the YMCA. The city will be engaging with Beverly Bootstraps. We'll have a display table focused on the Bass River at the Beverly Earth Fest at Lynch Park on Sunday, April 23rd. We'll also be offering the opportunity to learn about the Bass River and its watershed from the river itself at the Bass River Paddle, and that's on May 21st with a rain date on June 17th. And we'll have some kayaks available to reserve in advance and invite anyone who has a kayak or supboard to join us, so stay tuned for that. And finally, we'll be convening again with an in-person public meeting in late May or early June to share the conclusion of the study.
Great, thank you, Allison. And so can go back. Thank you. Just real quickly, also, we can touch on some other next steps are going to be some conceptual resilience strategies, developing near and long-term resilience strategies for coastal resource areas, critical infrastructure and community assets, marine uses, and other commercial and industrial sites, and also flood resilience concepts that are district-wide, including nature-based solutions along the Bass River. We'll be using coastal flood models to evaluate these concepts and developing flood resilience recommendations for future work. So we'll have more to say about those at our upcoming second public meeting, which again will be taking place sometime in late May or early June, and we'll have that in person. Next slide, please. All right, thank you for being here. I do want to just extend an open invitation for anyone who does have photos of flooding in the Bass River District that you're welcome to submit those to me at bpillen@beverlyma.gov. If you have other questions or comments about this resilience study, you're also welcome to reach out to me, as well as view the project page on our website. And we'll now answer if you have any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand and we can call on you that way. We do also have a short video that we wanted to share that's a recap of our walk and talk event from a few weeks ago. So perhaps we can actually go ahead and share that. Then we can come back and answer any questions if there are any. And this is just under 3 minutes.
Represent the extent of sea level rise during a storm. And so the pink represents the red on the map for 2030. So the pink during a storm could be about 6 inches deep with water. The orange is about 1 foot. The yellow is 1.5 feet. The green is 2 feet. And then the blue down there is kind of everything else, anywhere from 3 to 10 feet. During a storm, the water could reach all the way up to the road, and that's only the next 7 years. You can see in the 2050 and 2070 maps, it reaches much further and goes past the road as well. Here's 2070.
Yeah. You can stand right there, and there are a couple things we can observe. So do you see that line where we have all that little plastic pieces, the red, the yellow, the blue? How do you think that got there? High water mark. Okay, so that's called a rack line, W-R-A-C-K. And when you go to the beach or, you know, walking along a river or the coast and you see that rock line, you can know that that was a recent high tide. So we were talking over there about the water coming up in 2030. It's already happening. We saw the tide up coming up there. We talked about it over how, and so here is the potential, and is this is 2030 again. At 2030, the water could get this high, if it hasn't already. And then by 2070, it could be all the way up here, almost 5 feet, 4.8 feet.
You're talking about during a storm?
During a storm. This cold weather. You're welcome.
Great, so that was our walk and talk on a very cold and snowy wet day a few weekends ago. I did see a few questions come into the chat during that, so I can I'll go through. Let's see.
Brad, do you mind if I just asked a clarifier?
Sure.
So the little bit of back and forth there about what those elevation, projected elevations represent. It's not a regular tide, it's a storm surge at a high tide. That's how I understand, but I don't want to be wrong in my understanding either.
Yeah, I'll let maybe Nasser or Katie answer that if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah, so, because we have a pretty large tide range in Massachusetts and on the Bass River, we typically see the worst flooding when there's coastal storm surge that syncs up with high tides. So the results that are shown there are likely the peaks at the high tide coinciding with storm surge.
Great, thanks, Nasser. So one of the questions that we have in the chat is a floodgate on the river a possibility? Katie, I'm wondering if you might want to take that question.
Sure. So I'm hoping this is somebody who read the coastal vulnerability assessment, because we did look at it more holistically, not just from Bass River District, but looking at both sides of the river and thinking about larger scale solutions. I think one of the things that we identified early in the coastal vulnerability assessment was it would be very challenging on the Bass River because of some of the land uses to find an appropriate place to try to put a floodgate. Without having an interruption to some of the things like the recreational boat use and some of the other activities that people like to engage in on the river. The other challenge really is that the river is fairly wide. And that it would be a very large undertaking of a project. There were some early ideas asking questions during that process about whether or not the bridge was a potential location. But I think ultimately when we look at a lot of the flood mapping, we think that likely the interventions are more land-based, and they're land-based in a way that creates an opportunity for both the active use of these sites and living with water. And so we think about ways, and I see the next question is a nature-based solution question about thinking of a combination of soft and structural solutions on the water's edge as likely a more economical and viable way to approach the project versus thinking about trying to control the full extent of the river. But I would always say, anything certainly is possible. But the lens that we're looking at it from here is more of a combination of solutions at the water's edge.
Great, thank you, Katie. And do you want to elaborate maybe and just talk a little bit more about nature-based solutions and maybe describing what some examples of that could be or what that could look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would welcome Salem Sound Coast Watch and Woods Hole Group chiming in as well. I think everyone on the team has had great experiences with different types of nature-based solutions for many projects. When we say a nature-based solution, we're often thinking of vegetated options, particularly that allow for some level of floodable space along the water's edge. So it could be thinking about elevating the land at the edge of the Bass River in an area that creates almost like terraces, where you would have a floodable space before you had a more developed portion of a property. And you would use different treatments there to possibly expand things like the salt marsh to be a buffer from some of the waves and the flood activity that you're seeing on the water's edge, or to be thinking about floodable open space and recreational trails that during a storm event could get wet, but for many days of the year likely would not be infringed upon by flooding. We think about opportunities to incorporate other solutions like green infrastructure to sort of manage the water that you have at the intersection of spaces that deal with rainwater flooding and coastal flooding. And so really trying to use vegetative options in which to manage water versus just trying to structurally block it. I know Allison's on here as well. I could give a couple of examples from Salem Sound Coast Watch of some projects you've done in the region that you like. Maybe Collins Cove is a good one.
Absolutely, yeah. So the living shoreline at Collins Cove was constructed in 2019. And that was essentially a restoration of a salt marsh that was really trying to grow in that area. And so we essentially just added salt marsh plants that were tolerant to the salt water to act as that buffer to attenuate wave action and try to absorb some of that incoming water. We also have built some rain gardens on Winter Island and other areas in Salem, and rain gardens are a great solution for managing all that storm water and ensuring that the water that does go into the river or the ocean doesn't have all of that runoff from pavement and such on it as well.
I would just add that, if you walk along the Bass River district, particularly in the northern sections, you'll notice a lot of erosion on the banks, and in some places that erosion is pretty close to roadway infrastructure or parks and things like that. So nature-based solutions can also be an important tool for managing erosion in these types of areas, because the plants help to hold the soil together and reduce the impact of periodic rising and falling of water levels and waves and currents and things like that. So that's another way in which nature-based solutions could be applied in this district.
Great, thanks, everybody. So another question here. It's wanting to know more about some of the resilience strategies that might be evaluated or considered for city properties or other properties in the district. So what are some of the strategies that could be considered, and what an evaluation might look like to determine what's best suited and feasible for those different locations or uses?
Sure, happy to take that. I think the person asking the question really noticed the nuance between sort of the two different buckets that are in our next steps. One is really thinking about some strategies for the different types of assets and classes. So when we think about flood protection, we think about it either on a site-by-site basis or on more of a neighborhood scale. So the strategies are intended to be more site-based, something like the Margin Street pump station. And recently we worked with the city of Beverly to look at the Water Street pump station with SESD. And, one of the real strategies to that was thinking about having a combination of measures that work on an individual site. So you might have structural protections, something like flood proofing the entry points into the station. You might have more soft solutions, like thinking about raising the elevation of the land around the pump station to provide a buffer from the rising water. And then you might think about it as a combination of the two. Can we enhance the natural resource area near it to create a buffer? And at the same time, do some of the hardening that we need to do at the station to move the electronics panels up higher so that they're out of the way of any incidental or tidal flooding. So that's when we're working on sort of a site-by-site basis. And then, as Nasser mentioned, one of the things that we're thinking about is that district-wide strategy, which is to really look at the district as a whole and say, how could we link together multiple sites and think about more broad protections? And that part can be a little bit more challenging, right? Because we do have very different types of uses at each one of these individual sites. And so part of our work here is to take all that data collection that we talked about to understand each site and say what might be a best fit here. Can we group together some adjacent properties to provide protection north of the bridge and then try to work on the property south of the bridge independently? Could we work at the underpass at Federal Street to really eliminate a big flood pathway? And I think that, you know, those are the opportunities that we start to see from doing all of the coastal modeling and all of the data collection work. So we're tackling it in multiple different ways there. And what you'll see when we're done with the project is really a presentation of a lot of those different options so that the community can start to think about which ones they'd like to pursue in the future.
Thank you, Katie. The next question is asking, is there a way to plan to share information on what's actively happening on the commercial side of the river? So in this case, meaning the Bass River District, I believe, whether that be nature-based solutions or man-made or coastal hardening infrastructure, in coordinating permitting and materials so that residents on the other side of the river could possibly reduce their own costs of implementation. So essentially, can we take what we're learning with this in the Bass River District and apply that and share resources and costs to save money on the other side where there's more of a residential neighborhood?
I really like that question. And I think, you know, that's actually something that we found in all the resiliency work that we've done in the city of Beverly, is that there are really good lessons learned from each of the different strategies. And so, you know, when we think of something like the coastal vulnerability assessment, it was looking at all of Beverly's coastlines and different classes of assets. And it really identified a lot of the challenges on the residential side of Bass River that I believe the person asking the question is highlighting here, which is, you know, there are stormwater issues on that side that mirror some of the issues that we see on this side. So whether that be the erosion patterns or the roadways that are incredibly close to the river, some of the strategies that we develop here will likely be applicable on the other side of the river as well. There are a lot of smaller sewer pump stations within the residential portion or the western portion of the Bass River that could use some of the similar strategies that Margin Street Pump Station or Water Street Pump Station are using. Some of the types of flood panels and different types of implementations for waterproof covers and different strategies are probably very applicable. So I think we would hope that people would pick this up and try to think about ways to implement on their own properties as well. We are going to talk obviously about the real benefits of trying to create more pervious surface and to let water infiltrate more naturally, whether it be stormwater or coastal and tidal surge, which is tremendously important. And we'll also probably talk a little bit about trying to think of ways to be adaptive over time, to try to back away from the very edge of the river and to allow for a little bit more buffer on properties. And I think that's pretty applicable across both sides of the river.
Great, thank you, Katie. So the next question here, how will storm surges affect the area just north of the project area on the map, particularly the Cummings Center and the condominiums in that area? Nasser, maybe, do you want to take that question? I know you're familiar with the flooding on the maps.
Maybe we could come back to this. I'm trying to open up the maps, the broader maps on my computer here.
Sure, yeah, we can come back to that. Thank you. So another question we have is the intersection in McKay and Elliott Street being evaluated for raising. Concerned about this as a means to evacuate from the Ryle side area.
I think it's a great question. Road raising is going to be something that we would consider as a potential solution. There are some low-lying roadways here that are certainly important to the ultimate connections. I do want to make sure that I'm being as spatially aware as I can. I believe McKay Street, where it meets Elliott, is going to be just outside the project boundary here and is something that is really well covered in the coastal vulnerability assessment. So I believe it has been highlighted through that program as a roadway that could be a candidate for road raising, but it wouldn't be specifically designed as part of this project because it's going to be outside of the study area. But, you know, I think we do think that that's an important strategy, and this can dovetail into the Cummings conversation, which is there are portions of Route 62, obviously, that have been vulnerable to coastal and stormwater flooding over time. And I know that certainly the city has worked to address many of the issues related to stormwater. But the Cummings Center and Elliott Street really are the intersection of sort of two different types of spaces: the tidal space within the Bass River itself, and then more upland stormwater challenges that the city works on and has worked on historically to really try to address inland flooding.
Great, thank you, Katie.
And apologies, but the software I'm trying to run remotely right now is taking its sweet time. So I probably won't be able to pull it up right now. I would just say that the Cummings Center area, I know does show to be at risk from coastal flooding that would go over Elliott Street and then penetrate the upper parts of the watershed. As Katie was mentioning, as you are north of Elliott Street, you start to get into combined flooding risks from not just where coastal flooding would dominate as the kind of setting the highest bar for how high water would get, but also having to deal with all the storm water that drains to that point, before going under Elliott Street and into the Bass River District that we're studying as part of this project. So the Cummings Center area is not part of our scope for this project. It's not the main focus area. And I think that's probably where I'll have to leave it right now. Unfortunately, it's just not loading fast enough.
So to follow up on that a little bit, and I want to thank our colleagues at MVP and at EEA. Michelle Roden did put a nice link in here for people to be able to look directly at the state's page related to nature-based solutions. And, I think you're starting to hear us talk about, where is the intersection there between your coastal flood risk and potentially inland stormwater risk. And the beauty of nature-based solutions is that they really are very applicable in both locations. And, some of the strategies for coastal flooding are very similar to the strategies for inland flooding. Which is, again, really thinking from our perspective of ways to capture and infiltrate water wherever possible, to use more vegetative and pervious surfaces in which to be able to really absorb that water over time. And I think the link provided is a great resource here to be able to take a look at that toolkit that the state has provided on nature-based solutions.